Hello and welcome to Resilience, the global adaptation podcast, the show where we'll be exploring the best solutions and cutting-edge technologies for adapting to climate change.
From climate-resilient forests to the use of artificial intelligence to the power of storytelling, we are coming to you from the United Nations Environment Programme. I'm Liz Bernhardt.
And I'm Marcus Neild. In our podcast, we'll be talking to the world's greatest adaptation experts, but we'll also be travelling around the world to meet people on the front lines of climate change to hear personal stories of how they've built resilience.
We're really excited to share some incredible climate success stories with you. Join us as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time.
So today I'm joined by UNEP's very own head of news, Keisha Ruki. Keisha, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be here. So when I heard your team was doing an adaptation podcast, I thought it was quite exciting to be involved in a podcast on the environment.
Well, it's great to have you on. So you'll be hosting this episode with me today, but then also another episode later in the series about UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report, which is the most comprehensive, certainly the most widely cited annual adaptation report in the world. So really looking forward to that.
Thanks. Yes, I feel like I've joined up at a good time because today we're talking about a topic that I find super interesting, youth. As an aunt who's frequently asked many tough questions by my siblings, teens and young adults, it's a subject I'm interested in learning a bit more about. And so the UN defines young people as aged between 15 and 24. And today that accounts for 1.2 billion people in the world.
And I think it's fair to say, perhaps even obvious to say, that a lot of those 1.2 billion young people are taking climate change very seriously. I mean, we've seen it all on our TV screens with the rise of youth climate activism. So just a couple of stats. Now, our producers are often telling us off for having too many stats, but we're just going to do it anyway. So a widely cited study showed that 70% of young people across 10 countries were either extremely worried or very worried about climate change. But it gets worse. So over half of them said that, quote, humanity is doomed due to climate change.
But despite those stats, young people have absolutely not given up. We're seeing them forcing themselves into the conversation at major global climate events. Arguably, Greta Thunberg is the most well-known of these young activists. And I know others like my countrywoman, Vanessa Nakate, working with UNICEF now, are riding this wave of youth climate action that we're already starting to see swell and grow.
True. And I think one of the reasons why our adaptation team at UNEP loves to do what we do is that the solutions, if you think about it, are actually often very tangible and very local. So each place experiences climate change differently, so the solutions are always tailored to that local context. What that means is, in effect, is that everyone, including young people, can almost always get involved in some way with building resilience in their own community. The solutions are for everyone.
Indeed. And in that same vein, today we're going to be covering an initiative that is emblematic of how adaptation can be an entry point for young people to get involved in climate action. That's the EPIC network. But first, let's see what the CEO of the multi-billion-dollar Global Environment Facility has to say about how the facility and the climate community more generally are embracing what the youth are bringing into the space.
Carlos Manuel Rodriguez has been a strong advocate of youth involvement in the climate space his whole life. Before joining the Global Environment Facility in 2020, he was the Costa Rican Minister of Environment and Energy. And during his time as minister, Costa Rica doubled the size of its forests. He began by talking about his close connection to nature.
Welcome, Carlos Manuel. Very nice to have you on this podcast.
It is my real pleasure, Keisha.
So looking at your bio on the Global Environmental Facilities website, it describes you as a lawyer by profession, a politician by choice, and a conservationist at heart, which is great, but is certainly what we'd expect of someone in your position. What I found slightly more interesting was your description on X as a soul surfer. I'd be really interested to know what that means.
Well, I'm a surfer. I've been surfing for 45 years, and I began surfing in the mid 1970s when surfing was not even recognized as a sport. There were very little competition, and most of the surfers were people who had that special connection with the oceans and the marine wildlife and exploring new geographies, looking for waves. It was very interesting. There were no roads, no lodging. You had to go camping. I mean, it was a very nice experience and contact with nature. Now, surfing has become even an Olympic sport. It's highly competitive, very commercial, and we believe that that connection with the ocean has been lost in the in act today. A soul surfer is how we name those surfers who had that very special connection for with the ocean and are in a sense a steward of the ocean. So that's why I put it as such in my small bio there.
Thanks so much, Carlos Manuel. So, we're going to talk today about the topic of youth and all the many, many different ways around the world that we see the youth building climate resilience. But just before we get into the topic of today, would you mind telling us a little bit about your organization, the Global Environment Facility, and in particular how the facility is helping the world adapt to climate change?
So the JEF is this multilateral organization. When you hear the name multilateral, means many nations. Is an international organization, and it was created in 1992 like a bank, a financial mechanism. And this is what the JEF is. We are the financial mechanism for the Rio Conventions. We work in 150 countries. Today, we have around 2,000 projects being implemented with a budget of around $8.4 billion.
I'm going to ask you a slightly more personal because you mentioned that you when you grew up surfing in Costa Rica. Have you seen the kind of environmental degradation that we sort of talk about all the time over the years? And are there any projects that you witnessed where the work of adaptation projects has really sort of worked and come to life and restored and sort of allowed nature to exist again in the way that it did once?
That is a very good question. Probably the best case is my own country, Costa Rica. I grew up, I was born in the 60s, grew up and during the 70s and 80s, Costa Rica lost most of their forests. We lost by probably 1978, 1980, we lost 80% of our forests. I saw that. I saw the change in the landscapes. I saw the change in the climate. I saw the change in the watersheds. And this was due to the fact that Costa Rica had created all kind of policies and incentives for the development of agricultural activities, particularly cattle ranching. So cattle ranching was the main driver of deforestation. But if you fast forward 30 years to today, miracle has happened in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has been able in the last 2 decades not just stop deforestation, but double the size of the forest and has gone 100% renewable energy in the electric sector. At the same time that the population double and the economy triple, meaning that restoring landscape, restoring forest ecosystem is not a burden to development. One of the strongest benefit of what we did in Costa Rica and with the support of Jeff and many other international organizations was that we were the only country in Central America that has been able to recover forests in the last 2 decades. So, whenever the hurricane comes from the Caribbean and hits these 7 countries, guess who is the country who can support better the impacts of climate change? Well, Costa Rica. So, having a country with almost 55% forest cover out of 20% 20 years ago make us very resilient. So, this is a good example.
That's fantastic. A great example and such a good story, especially given we deal with so much negative climate stories. You know what I mean? It's awesome to hear one where the action has really paid off. So I'm now turning to youth because obviously you were once a young person who was interested in conservation and ended up taking this career path. I'm wondering what you did, what it was that drove you down this career path, and if you would have any sort of advice for young people seeking to make a real difference in their futures.
Well, thank you, Keisha, for your question. I do have 5 kids. They are all between 20 and 30, and they are very, very mad with what my generation has done with nature and planet Earth. You got to see my late night dinner conversation with my kids because they are really concerned because my generation has compromised their future. I was part of the youth movement of the UN. I was there as a kid pushing for ambition, pushing for decision, particularly in the Convention of Biological Diversity. So I've been there. I know what it means to feel frustrated, to feel alone, to be feeling that you're David and you're fighting a huge Goliath. Uh, and when I was in my 20s in Costa Rica and I saw the deforestation, I was one of the first people writing in newspapers and writing on magazines about deforestation and and the threats to human well-being and economy and the economy that deforestation generated. I felt quite alone, and I felt that the scale of the change was so huge that it was going to be impossible. And we thought that probably the best way was creating some protected areas and put aside from development some areas because of their biodiversity value. And this is the seed of the national parks system in Costa Rica, which, by the way, is a large system that attracts a lot of tourism and protects a lot of biodiversity. So this is a very interesting story of hope. So I think that the same way I live that I seen that the young generation, the youth, are really, really conscious and concerned about what is happening. And the impacts of climate change are disproportionately concentrated in less developed countries and small island states. And within those societies, women and the children are the most vulnerable. So we got a moral responsibility in order to give the change. That's my first take. My second take, from what I saw when I was young to what I see today with the youth, is that back then you had to be a biologist or something similar to a biologist to be able to engage and protect nature. Now you don't need to be a biologist to save the planet. Wherever you may be as a youth, whatever may be your career path, whatever your vocation, you will be confronted with the need of having you being a positive source of action towards sustainability.
So, Carlos Manuel, it's clear that this is a topic that you're really passionate about. So, could you tell us what are some specific programs and partnerships at the Jeff that are aimed towards engaging young people in climate action or empowering them to be climate leaders?
For years and years, we've been providing indirect support to civil society, in this case, youth, indigenous people, and women. Also, the Jeff has another program that is aimed to civil society, which is called the Small Grant Program. The Small Grant Program, as the name says, are small grants given to civil society, and 40% of those projects are being implemented with young people in the countries that we work. But that is far from enough because we strongly believe that we will never, the Jeff, achieve our mandate in terms of generating global environmental benefit if we only work with governments. We need to really level up our portfolio with much more investment with civil society and particularly with the youth. So here's where we are close to our next replenishment. This is how we capitalize the fund, and as we replenish our fund, we revisit the policies and programs. And here's where youth will come big time from 2025 on. We expect by 2030 that the JEF may become or should become the biggest grant maker for the youth movement, women, and indigenous people in the context of the international convention. So we have big aspirations on how to do that. So for us, it's a matter of two things. One is it is a moral imperative to provide support to youth, and second, we strongly believe that our expected impacts and results of what we do with government can be enhanced and be more sustainable if we include direct finance and access to that finance to the youth.
Obviously, your story and Costa Rica's is a very positive one and one that fills with hope. But of course, they're very disillusioned at the moment when you do speak to them, much like your own children. What are the glimmers of hope that you would say, don't lose hope, things are happening?
Well, I think that there's a lot of reasons to be extremely helpful, not just because the technology is helping us, the financial resources are getting there, but most importantly, there is a global recognition that we are confronting a very serious ecological crisis at the highest political level. What we need is a change of guard in terms of the global leadership and national leadership. We need those young people really stepping in and working their way out in politics and in the private sector where they can be agents of change.
That's great, Carlos Manuel. Your passion and enthusiasm for the topic has certainly come through. So we just have one final question for you. We like to ask a lot of our guests this question. We always get different answers, so it's always really interesting. So not just looking at youth now, but adaptation more generally. What would you say is the one topic in climate adaptation that no one is talking about?
The one topic that no one talks about when we talk about resilience and climate change is the role of protected areas. Protected areas were created with a vision of preserving biodiversity, but today, without any doubt, and the evidence is out there, the benefits that protected area give us in terms of resilience and adaptation to climate change is huge. So I strongly believe that this is the most underrated area in terms of benefits for the resilience and climate change.
Thank you so much for joining us, Carlos Manuel.
It's my pleasure, Keisha. The same, Marcus.
Very nice. Okay, so now time to see some of these solutions on the ground. So, as our audience is coming to know, in this series, we love pairing our global expert guest with an inspiring local action voice. So, let's meet a young person who's making a real difference in her city.
So Zanele Luthuli is from Durban, South Africa, and she's part of the EPIC Network, a new youth movement. The EPIC Network matches students with real-world sustainability challenges in their local area. The students get direct, hands-on experience at solving problems while their city or town can improve their sustainability, especially in places where resources are really strapped.
The EPIC network has been described by the New York Times as, quote, perhaps the most comprehensive effort by a university to infuse into its curricula sustainability and community outreach. Our good friend and colleague Liz Bernhardt caught up with Zanele to see how the EPIC network has been helping the informal settlements in Durban build resilience to the climate crisis.
Hi, Zanele. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today. It's really a pleasure to meet you. And I'm not sure if you know, but Marcus and I were actually in Durban about 4 years ago. But we were extremely impressed with what we saw was happening at the university and in the local community. For the rest of our listeners, I'd love to ask if you can tell us a bit about what you're doing and where you are.
I'm Zanele Luthuli. I am currently a student at University of KwaZulu-Natal. I am currently pursuing a master's degree in the built environment field. Right now, my research is based on what makes a city livable and are we excluding informal settlements, and how can we make them more resilient to adapt to all these social, economic, and political and environmental issues that they are facing.
So that's a nice introduction to what we wanted to talk to you about today, Zanele. So we're really keen to discuss the EPIC project in Durban, which Liz and I visited. But also we wanted to ask you about the EPIC model more generally as well. What is the EPIC model? What does it do?
In simple terms, EPIC stands for Educational Partnerships and Communities. The A would be for in the context of Africa. So I was exposed to the module when I was doing my honors, which aimed to give the students in development studies a new way to look at things in a transdisciplinary approach, using new methods to really try and understand development study concepts and planning concepts. We had people from the municipality come give us seminars in class, and we'd be given assignments on what we learned. My professor, Prof. Kathy, really believed in getting the creative expression out of the student of what did you learn? Where do you see the problem in your community? And how can you bring about change? So the EPIC module for me was really a game changer because of all those experiences. I remember very correctly, we had Patrick Martel, who's part of the Palmade Riverine Rehabilitation Project. We've also had a climate adaptation specialist at the eThekwini municipality come in for one of our lecturers. We also had a University College of London knowledge exchange, and we have that interchange of realizing that we are in totally different parts of the world, but we are somewhat concerned about the same issues, which just really shows you the effects of climate change and how we really need to be advocating for sustainable livelihoods and development as a whole.
I'm on the board of EPIC, and one of the things that we like about EPIC, which is what you've just described, is that it is multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary. I'd love to know what you personally found inspirational about the project that you worked on in Durban.
This project was a game changer for me because it helped me to understand that as a postgraduate student, you really need to be researching about things that will bring about change. So, not just researching for the sake of you just want to get your degree done. So, because of the EPIC module, for me, I was able to really look into the major issues that we are facing in the context of Durban. So, because of that, I was able to choose a topic for my honors year that really was something that the municipality wanted to answer, which was upgrading the issues of upgrading informal settlements and the challenges that the municipality and the communities are facing with addressing all these problems in the informal settlements.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about these people that you've mentioned in the community. What were the climate impacts that these communities were facing?
Good question, Marcus. So I come from a township and it's unlike an informal settlement. I live in a big house. I have running water, electricity, access to shops, services, roads. Once I started with working with the EPIC project, I was actually exposed to a different side of the world or South Africa. I didn't know that there were people in informal settlements facing such immense challenges. The informal settlement that I worked very closely with was Quarry Road West. It is situated along the floodplain of the Palmate River, which is quite dangerous because it's a flood risk prone. In the events of floods, they are the first ones hit. The recent floods were in 2022, some were in 2019, and it left very devastating results where houses were washed away and lives were lost. But because of partnerships and relationships that we have with the community, we've been able to help them understand about how to make themselves more adaptive and resilient to the climate, knowing that there are dangers of living in the settlements really helps them to be more sensitive and aware about the dangers of living here and accepting them because that's where they are, but also really helping them to understand this is how they can kind of bounce back once they've been hit by a flood.
Now, Zanele, I understand that once you, the students, had familiarized yourselves with the needs of the local community, one of the solutions you devised was a disaster risk management plan. And I gather the idea here is to help people understand where they should live or where they shouldn't live as a result of the danger from the floods. So could you tell us how that plan was shared with the local community? How did they adopt the plan, and is it still used today?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very important question, Marcus. For example, with the disaster risk map that they created with the community was involved in creating the map. So one of the ways the map was shared, there was focus group meetings held with the researchers, being the university and the municipality, inviting the community to let them know that, okay, this is your settlement. We understand that you live here, but these are the areas that you need to avoid the most. And even those who were not present at the meeting, there were posters hung around the settlement. So it had all the information with the map. So everyone in the settlement could look at the map, kind of like a guideline to know, oh, this area you must avoid when it's raining or, when you're trying to build your settlement.
Great. And so the result of that essentially is that people are no longer building their homes in really dangerous zones.
Yes, so essentially if I said I wanted to go and move in there, now I know which area is best to avoid, because in the past there's been maybe floods there and that area was struck the most.
Now, I understand that another solution that you and the students developed was an early warning system. So just for our listeners that don't know, early warnings, essentially they provide alerts to communities that are at risk from extreme weather. And what that does is it allows the communities to take steps to prepare in advance, essentially. So could you tell us how that was developed and sort of what form did it take, this early warning system?
The early warning systems were implemented around 2019. Prior to that, they had the 2017 floods, which were disastrous. Moving forward, we had other floods. But because of the early warning system that was implemented through the EPIC project, the settlers were able to be notified that a storm is coming or heavy rain is coming. And with that, we're not saying vacate immediately, but the warnings, they came bit by bit to say, okay, the water levels are rising to this much, like for the river. So you need to start telling the ones who are closer to the river to move to higher ground, start moving your belongings, be safe, move the kids, so those little warning systems were able to alert the people that the trouble is coming. So in future, what happened next, like in 2022, a lot of lives were saved. No one actually lost so much in comparison to the other years.
Amazing. Okay. And one of the questions I have for you, Zanele, is what the kind of experience was like as a student, and not just yourself, but maybe you can tell us a little bit, what did the other students say about the project?
I know one personal, we were in class together. It kind of inspired her to pursue GIS more.
For those that don't know, GIS is Geographic Information Systems, isn't it? And it's essentially creating
yes. Geographic
maps
information.
with spatial data.
Yes. And in saying that, I mean, she saw how creating the risk map with the community members was so helpful on the ground, that so many people rely on it now, that they now know where is it safe and where is it dangerous, that now she believes in helping people through GIS. I, for one, now enjoy working with people. I believe more in research because of this experience through the EPIC project. And I know many other students have that feeling as well about the EPIC module. So I really believe it's been impactful. And it's one of the most practical modules that we had. The other modules were just very theory-based. We never went out on the field. But with this one, it was even after we had received all our marks, we could still work with the community members, and we had established this lovely relationship with them. So I don't know. I think it really had an impact on other students as well. And I highly do recommend that the school continues to deliver the EPIC project. Yeah. It kind of really just prepares you for the real world, because that's what's happening, not just to sit in class and write and think about all these ideas, but actually see what's happening. So I think that module really gave us that as students.
Amazing. Thank you, Zanele. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today. And I feel like if other young people are anything like you, then we may be in safe hands after all.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Thank you, Liz.
So today we've heard from two quite different guests, giving us an interesting blend of perspectives. From Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, we've heard about what inspires the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar environment fund. We've learnt about how Costa Rica increased its resilience through forest restoration, how the Global Environment Facility is providing grants to spur youth action, and why, in Carlos Manuel's words, you no longer need to be a biologist to save the planet. And from Zanele Luthuli, we've gotten to know about the EPIC network and how it's helped informal settlements in South Africa protect themselves from flooding through student-designed adaptation solutions, whether that be a disaster management map or a new early warning system. Just to add, the EPIC model was actually developed in the US, and it's really interesting to see in the space of a few years how it's spread across the world, now in Africa, now in Asia Pacific, and now in Latin America and the Caribbean. For those that want to know more about the EPIC network, we will put a link in the show notes. And what we've seen is that the partnerships created between university faculties and their local communities can actually be really long-lasting and self-sustaining. So it really is worth looking into it, especially if you're a student that's really looking for that kind of more practical hands-on experience. Now, before we wrap up today, just one final thing we'd like to share, which is the Young Champions of the Earth Award. If you're a young person who's excelled in protecting the environment, you could potentially be a winner of the Young Champions Award. The winners receive seed funding, intensive training, and tailored mentoring to bring their big environmental ideas to scale. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. So that's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you to our guests, Carlos Manuel and Zanele. Join us next time as we adapt to climate change, one conversation at a time.
This show is sponsored by the Japanese Ministry of the Environment. Richard Myron is the producer, and this has been an Earshot Strategies production.